Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our second session today. With us this morning is David Goldfarb from the ARC-US. He's the Director of Policy there. We also have Robyn Linscott, who's the Director of Education and Family Policy at the ARC-US. I just want to mention Darcy Milburn, who couldn't join us, is the Director of Social Security and Healthcare Policy, and she also contributed to this session. So I want to thank David and Robyn for joining us today, and I'm going to turn it over to them.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Sherry. Great to be here. As mentioned, I'm David Goldfarb, Director of Long-Term Supports and Services Policy, and I'm here with my colleague, Robyn Linscott. We're going to start off with Robyn, who's going to give you just a little background on kind of Congress 101, so you understand the makeup and how to be better advocates. So I'll turn it over to Robyn.
Sorry. Thank you so much, David. As David mentioned, I'm Robyn Linscott. I'm the Director of Education and Family Policy at the ARC-US. So that means I handle everything from childcare, K-12, higher ed, paid family leave, child welfare, things of that nature. I seem to be getting a little bit of feedback. Sorry. Give me 1 second. All right, can you hear, David, can you hear me okay?
Yeah,
okay.
You're coming in fine.
Okay, great. So we wanted to just give a little bit of kind of background and federal legislative process 101, because I know sometimes, we policy people can sometimes be in our own little wonky bubble, and we want to make sure that, when we're talking about things, that process is a little bit clear. So as you can see from this chart, and I know that these slides will be made available to everybody, we kind of have the same process that is happening simultaneously through the House and the Senate. So when a bill is introduced, sometimes it is introduced in just the House. Sometimes it is introduced in just the Senate. Sometimes it is introduced at exactly the same time. I know I'm going to be speaking about bills that fall into both of those categories. Some are just in the House, some are just in the Senate, and some are in both simultaneously. So once a bill is introduced in either the House or the Senate, it is referred to a committee. So the clerk of the House or the Senate looks at the bill and says, all right, this falls into this category, so it's going to go to this committee, or it falls into this category. So the committees that I work with most often in the Senate is called the HELP Committee, the Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. And on the House side, the committee I work most often with is called Education and Workforce. Fun fact about that committee is that the name of the committee changes depending on which party is in the majority. So Republicans like to call the committee Education and Workforce. Democrats like to call it Education and Labor. It is the same exact committee. So once a bill has been referred to that committee, a subcommittee, a smaller group, has some type of action. So they usually have a hearing, a markup where they actually go through the bill. There's some debate. They can add things, change things, amend things. And it is that smaller group that is doing that work first. Then after that kind of markup or that hearing, they are going to vote the bill out. So you might hear somebody say this bill was voted out of subcommittee favorably. That means, more people voted to say, yes, this bill is good to go. So it gets voted out of the subcommittee. Then it goes to the whole committee. So the larger committee, but still not talking about the whole Senate, the whole House. Then kind of the same thing happens again with the larger committee. They will have a markup. Again, you've got more people and more voices now that can add things, change things. Then same process, it is voted and needs to be brought to the whole House or the whole Senate floor for a vote. So often the two places in this process where we kind of see these sticking points, or we see these where things kind of get stalled, is oftentimes we'll have a bill introduced and it gets referred to a committee, and then it just sits there. One of the bills I'm going to talk about, the Keeping All Students Safe Act, has been sitting introduced to its committee since it was introduced. And that will often happen on bills that, people don't really want to take action on, or they think, this isn't a bill that we think is going to move, or for whatever reason, we aren't happy with the, with what we think is going to happen. So we're going to pause it there. The other place is after it has come out of the full committee and it's ready to be introduced onto the House or the Senate floor. That's kind of the other place we see things stalled. The speaker and the majority leader in the Senate kind of get to decide when these things get brought to the floor for a whole vote. So they have a lot of discretion in when that piece happens. All right, next slide, please.
Well, and I'll just add, I'll just add one or two little important.
Oh yeah, the
points.
whole piece of it going to the president. David, do you want to add that?
No. Well, what I want to point out is the committees are really the locus of power on particular issues. So it is worthwhile to look at, what committee does your member of Congress or senator sit on, and in some cases you might be gearing your advocacy on a particular topic. So you have to pick between Robyn's education piece or my Medicaid piece. If the person sitting on the committee that oversees Medicaid, you're going to want to push the Medicaid piece more with them because they have the power. So that's the only point I wanted to make. Those committees are really important, and who sits on them.
Yeah. Sorry, that actually made me, David, think of kind of one more final piece of, when you if you all are doing advocacy, it's important to know that members usually have staff that work both in their personal office, but they also might have staff that solely work on the committee. And then the committee itself also has staff. They're usually referred to as professional staff members. And these tend to be the people, the staffers that have the most technical, in-depth knowledge of whatever the bill is. So often if there is an education bill we're working on, the help staff, the health, education, and labor staff themselves can often be the best points of contact for, for really kind of getting that intel and getting some things in there. So this actually leads us really well into this next slide, which is kind of how a congressional office is structured. So a congressional office usually has three kind of branches: policy people, communications people, and administrative people. David and I both fall into the policy side. When I worked on the Hill in the Senate, I was a legislative assistant, so working on education and disability policy. The policy people are going to be the people that when if you are trying to request a meeting with a member, those are the staffers that you are going to meet with. Legislative director kind of heads the whole policy team. A legislative assistant is going to handle a specific portfolio of issues. And a legislative correspondent is kind of acting a little bit in an assistant role. They're doing a lot of things. If you've ever sent an email to a member of Congress and you've gotten back that letter saying, "Thank you so much for contacting us about animal rights. Here's my position on animal rights," etc., that was usually written by a legislative correspondent. What's important to know is that, especially in the House, because the staff is so much smaller than it is in the Senate, a staffer might have a portfolio of 9 or 10 topics that range from, the Postal Service, NASA, and Medicaid. And so they might have a really specific wealth of knowledge in one of those areas, but it's just impossible for them to know everything. So it's it's important that when you are meeting with a staffer, never take for granted that they actually know about disabilities, that they actually know what intellectual and developmental disabilities mean, because they might be the staffer that does cover this issue, but they also cover 10 other things. I think that's the most important thing for me to hit on that. So a few key points for when you are lobbying, advocating, trying to get your views and what you want your action to be across to your member. Target your own member of Congress, whether that is your representative from your district or your two senators, Senator Gary Peters, Senator Debbie Stabenow. I don't know all the congressional members in Michigan. I'm not sure what districts you all are coming from. But it's important that you try and get meetings with your members. Obviously, they're much more willing to meet with constituents than they are with somebody who's outside their district, or certainly outside of Michigan. 98% of the time, you are going to be meeting with staff. And I think sometimes people feel disappointed by that they're not actually meeting with the member. But here's kind of the inside secret, is that most members don't know a ton about all of these issue areas. So the staff are really the ones who are making that recommendation to the members and saying, hey, I want to educate you on this bill. I want to tell you about these stories that I've been hearing from the ARC of Michigan about home and community-based services. So the staff, although it might seem a little bit less glitzy and fancy, the staff is really your inroad to actually getting your views and position heard. Share your story. Personal stories go a long way. And if possible, if you can, the 1-2 punch of being able to share a story and then linking it to data. So for example, when I talk about restraint and seclusion a lot, if I have a family member whose child experienced restraint and seclusion at school, and I'm also able to pull data that says, hey, look at how many incidents of restraint and seclusion happened in Michigan. That's all really important information that the staffer can bring back to the member when saying, hey, I think we should co-sponsor this bill or something like that. And again, staff handle many issues. So often this is really a time for them to, for you to educate them, and often might be the first time they're hearing about a specific set of issues.
Okay, well, thanks, Robyn. And with that, I'm going to kick it off with the legislative and some regulatory updates on first on SSI and then and Social Security, and then we'll talk about Medicaid, and I'll pass it over to Robyn on her issues. So just at the outset, some of the key differences, because we do have important benefits in both. A supplemental security income is that means tested benefit that provides a cash benefit for individuals with disabilities. It's means tested, and we're going to get into some of the core problems with that. And importantly, in most states, it's tied to what's called categorical eligibility of Medicaid. So it's really our key pathway, not only to help people that can't work be in the community or can only work to a limited extent. It also and provides cash support, but it also ensures access to Medicaid and ideally Medicaid on community-based services. On the other side, you have the social insurance program, called the Old Age Survivors and Disability Insurance Program, which is funded through payroll taxes. And so you qualify based on both a specific status, like a triggering event, but also based on the amount that you paid in. And so one of the really important ones for us beyond the traditional Social Security disability insurance is what's called the Disabled Adult Child Benefit, which is available to people that had a continuous disability that started before the age of 22 and their parent dies, retires, or develops a disability themselves. So many people, as they age within our community, will eventually get this benefit. And there's a whole process to ensuring that they can retain Medicaid, but in addition, they'll also get Medicare. So the biggest issues in this space right now, and we'll talk about some of these bills, raising asset limits and expanding benefits for SSI. The asset limit remains, as you know, and we'll talk about the legislation more, at about $2,000 for individuals, $2,000 for couples. It's becoming untenable. Another big area of focus over time is encouraging work. How do we allow people to work more without risk of losing Medicaid or their benefits so that they can stay in the community? There's also a larger issue that these benefits, both the disabled adult child benefit and SSI, contain disincentives for people to get married. And therefore that's becoming seen as a civil rights issue. We also have waiting periods, particularly for SSDI, as well as the disabled adult child benefit. Not just the delay in terms of when you can receive it for SSI, but importantly, that access to Medicare, which I'm sure many of you know, Medicare pays better and has, generally speaking, a broader access to providers than Medicaid. And so that's another important long-term issue we're working on. And then, of course, we always have to monitor the Social Security reform efforts. But it's either 2034 now or 2035. It changes a little bit every year. That Social Security overall trust fund won't, over 75 years, be able to pay out 100% of benefits. I don't think that necessarily means they can't pay out all benefits right away, but that's likely to trigger, as we move forward, more and more pressure to do something. Now, Congress typically does it at the last minute, so we probably won't see that major reform effort until then. All the while, we need to continue beating the drums about how this system needs to be improved and how it needs to be protected, because when that moment comes, we're going to be at a very critical point. And so we have to continue to socialize those issues, even if it's going to take a decade before major change. So the biggest, and in my view, one of the most exciting things happening right now is the SSI Savings Penalty Elimination Act, which is a bipartisan bill, bicameral bill, that is growing in its co-sponsorship and its supporters, which would raise the current asset limit within SSI from $2,000 for individuals and $3,000 for couple, with no adjustment for inflation, to $10,000 for individuals and $20,000 for couples, with an adjustment for inflation. When I first joined the ARC, which was now 2021, I lose track of time, 2021 or 2022, I did not believe that any kind of bipartisan bill was anywhere on the horizon for SSI. So this was a real surprise. And then the growth of the supporters has been even more incredible. So we've not only been able to get, and Darcy is the lead on this, just disability and aging advocates, but the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is the most powerful business lobby in the United States, supports raising the asset test. J.P. Morgan, a number of religious groups, because of their interest in things like poverty, are actually lobbying the Hill across the religious spectrum, across the denominations. So there's a very broad coalition now that is actually working towards raising this SSI asset limit that isn't just confined to aging and disability organizations, which is really, really exciting. And the other really big, well, I should say it's a small fix with bigger potential for passage. And I believe there's actually going to be a hearing soon on this issue around work. Deals with the disabled adult child benefit, which requires, as I mentioned, this continuous disability before the age of 22. But importantly, even after that age, if you ever went over what's called substantial gainful activity, which is essentially the test for when you're working, if you earn a certain amount, then it's considered that you don't have a disability for the purposes of Social Security. The reason being because those tests relate to whether one can work. It's not, do I have X or Y? It's, do those limitations limit you functionally, where if you don't have supports, you can't earn or work a certain amount. So that's that test. If you ever went over that once, then you're completely barred from the benefit. And so we see a lot of instances, for example, when someone's working at the grocery store, they're being independent. Maybe they went over 1/4 and then suddenly they are out of luck to getting this benefit. And typically this benefit pays better than SSI because it's based on your parents' work record. And SSI has like 75% of the federal poverty level. So this typically pays a little better. But if you ever received SSI first and then you get this benefit, you can still maintain your Medicaid eligibility. So you get you can have more financial resources while maintaining eligibility. Work is really one of those areas that is bipartisan. Cost can be an issue. So this is bipartisan legislation in the Senate that we're continuing to work on. And it's something that I know the chair of the Finance Committee who sponsors this bill wants to try to move forward. So we'll be working on that. I know Darcy's working on that as well. Just some quick updates on the regulatory side. And I don't have a slide on this, but I want to say there's been a long chain, and then politics is the art of doing the same thing over and over again until one day it happens. And so suddenly many things did happen. First is that the ARC with a couple other advocates have long been pushing for reforms related to what's called in-kind support and maintenance. In-kind support and maintenance is if you're getting SSI, income will count against your benefit and be reduced depending on when you worked for it, or it was just, for example, given to you, or pension. But they also count other things, in particular, rent, for example, can reduce your benefit by up to 1/3. So if you're living in your parents' house, that's considered living rent-free if you're an adult with a disability on this side, and therefore your benefits get reduced. So the first element was we were able to get food excluded from that in-kind support maintenance. So you don't have to worry about paying for food. I couldn't hear the previous session, but I saw you were talking about pooled trusts. So for example, now, if you have money in trust, that trust can now buy food without concern of whether it's going to reduce that individual's benefit. It really just remains rent. The second big one, which is a little more technical, relates to an exception to in-kind support and maintenance that is in regulation, not in statute, which says that if the individual is in a household, so everyone in the household is on public assistance, then, since that money is coming from, in effect, the government, it's not going to be reduced, and they can live, for example, rent-free or at reduced rent without reducing their benefit. There was a narrow set of circumstances when that occurred, largely related to cash welfare benefits. Going back before I joined for years, we had been working on expanding that, and Social Security expanded that definition so that anyone who's part of a household that's getting SNAP, they exempted. So although SSI, you get SNAP eligibility, if you're living with parents, let's say, or other individuals that also receive SNAP benefits of their own, then you might qualify for being excluded from support and maintenance. So that was really exciting. And then Martin O'Malley, former Maryland governor, so we know him a little better here, was confirmed as Social Security commissioner just recently. And he has really taken the bull by the horns, and Social Security is a bull. It's massive. It's the biggest judicial system in the world in terms of its administrative law. It's underfunded. It's at its lowest staffing level 25 years, and it deals with millions of people and millions of payments. He was able to move in and quickly get a number of important changes in policy, and Darcy is still working with them at the highest levels of Social Security on trying to get some additional changes. But the big one for us was overpayments, which has just been a complete disaster in terms of the data coming into Social Security, for example, reporting wage payments and then not correcting your benefit. So they made a couple of immediate changes. One is reducing that withholding if there is a overpayment from 100% to 10%. They've lengthened the time of repayment plans, 3 to 5 years. They're raising the bar of the overpayments. So if there's an overpayment of less than $2,000, it's waived. And one of the most important pieces is this legal shift of the burden of proof of the overpayment from the individual to SSA. Because we know that in many cases, this is really because of SSA. They're underfunded, they don't have the system. So when you're reporting income from working, they're not adjusting the benefit properly until months later, and they say, oh, there's a big overpayment. So by shifting the burden of proof, they're going to say, we're going to presume first and foremost that it was the fault of the agency. And then the agency is going to have to look to see if the individual was at fault in any way, versus previously where if there is a overpayment, it's presumed that you are at fault. And now you must prove that the agency was in some way responsible. So that's a very helpful legal shift. Okay, and I apologize too that I don't have a time on it because we do want to answer questions at the end. So Sherry and Courtney, if we're running slow, just let us know. I have my part, and then it'll be Robyn's part, and we can take questions. So the issue I work on is really all of Medicaid, but in particular, of course, Medicaid home and community-based services. Just some sort of high-level issues with the Medicaid program in terms of the big fundamental problems that exist within the system, or at least some of them. One is that much of the program is optional. Even things like dental services is optional. States don't have to take it up to receive federal dollars. And of course, the big one for us is the fact that nursing facilities were mandated for those that qualify and meet the level of care standard. But Medicaid home community-based services is completely optional. And so that has led, among other things, to wait lists for services. Even waivers themselves are constrained in a number of ways, one of which is, in fact, capping the number of individuals that can be in there. You have to be spending less than the institutional level of care on a per capita basis, not an individual basis overall for people within home and community-based services. So that's one of the biggest vexing problems of this system that even really predates the current construction of Medicaid in 1965, because there was a different system before then that was also institutional. And of course, the Medicaid program is a means-tested benefit. We talked about the relation between SSI and Medicaid, but even if you're not on SSI, you still have to, in many cases, be completely impoverished. There are planning tools around that, whether it's ABLE accounts or trusts, but that's still not easy to navigate. And in addition, there are income limits and caps. And I can't recall, but I think that Michigan may be one of the states for your waivers where it's really SSI eligibility. So for example, there are cases in some states, and Michigan may be one, where if you get that disabled adult child benefit first and not SSI, you're going to be over the income limit and you'll never qualify for a waiver. So there are real issues in terms of the level of poverty, both in terms of the amount of money you can earn from work or through other sources, like a survivor benefit from someone's pension or from the amount you can save. The other issue is in some ways related to the structure of the Medicaid program being a state federal system. Medicare, because it's 100% federal, almost always pays much better rates than what Medicaid does, because there's less constraints in terms of the ability to tax and raise funds through debt at the federal level. And so we see a lot of low Medicaid rates almost across the board, not just for our issues, but of course, those low rates where we are is leading to poverty wages for direct care workers. And so you're dealing with a massive shortage of individuals, which I'm sure you're all aware has only worsened since COVID-19, and the challenges are only going to grow. And finally, another structural issue is that because these are state programs, there's no real portability between states, particularly for optional services. So yes, if you have SSI, maybe you can go and then quickly get physician care. But HCBS is optional. It's a different system. You got to start from the beginning. That's very problematic. So some key facts today: we have 700,000 people on wait lists. The vast majority, almost 3/4, are people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So when we talk about wait lists, we're really talking about our population. The average wait for those individuals is over 4 years on average, and we have stories past a decade. People, as I mentioned, you already know, there's a major workforce crisis going on in this country. There's always been a shortage, but right now it's worsening and worsening, where people are turning away. Even if you qualify for services, there aren't workers to provide that services. It's really the number one issue that we are focused on. So there's really three big major bills that we are working on and focused on. One is called the Better Care, Better Jobs Act. This would allow, so first let me just describe the policy. States could get a major boost, and 10% federal match doesn't really do it justice, because the way that the match works, it's not a 10% increase. It's the fact of how much of the share of federal and state dollars are. So for example, a 50% match, which is the lowest the match can be for the wealthiest states, is a 1-to-1 ratio. The poorest states, and I'm going to probably get my math wrong, but let's say like 80%, that could be $3 of every federal dollar spent, of every state spent. So that change from 10 to 50 is much better than just 10%. It's a lot of extra dollars. And it basically says if states were willing to take, get rid of their wait list, provide home and community-based services, raise wages, they could get this major boost. The reason this bill is important, it relates to all that advocacy you might recall you did in the previous Congress to try to get home and community-based services in that budget reconciliation package. Budget reconciliation is a way to get around this feature of the Senate called the filibuster, which is if you don't have enough votes, currently 60, then one senator can basically hold up the entire process, because they have an unlimited amount of time to speak. And so this is a way to get around that with only 50 votes instead of 60 under specific circumstances, which is it has to be basically about money. The next one is the one that would kind of solve everything. And so I like to, this is sort of the Medicare for all for home and community-based services. It would require 60 vote threshold to get through. And that would actually mandate, so it's changing the terms of the law, home and community-based services as a benefit under Medicaid. And it would create a full federal financing scheme for those services. So it takes part of the wage issue and it takes part of the mandate issue. And therefore, it also take care of the affordability issue. So this is really the big long-term goal. And then there's a more immediate need, but this is still a pretty big piece that we see as immediate. And one of our messages is, yes, we need something like the HCBS Access Act, over time. We understand that's a big package, but we need additional funding now because there's a crisis in states. And so the HCBS Relief Act is basically that 10% of federal match idea for 2 years in the current version, FY 2024, 2025. I don't expect this to pass this year, but one of the big things that's happening next year is the expiration of the 2017 tax cuts. A full extension of that would be over $4 trillion, which means there's a lot of money on the table. And so trying to get something like this in, if not more, depending on who's in charge, will be important. So ARPA, the American Rescue Plan, did this for 1 year, and that led to $37 billion of extra funding. So this is really in the realm of potentially 70 billion of extra funding we're asking for. So it's not small, but it's something that is needed right now, and that's the case we're trying to make. For this year, and we can hope, nothing is going to really pass, although Robyn may have one. So let's leave that as an exception. Most of the big things are not going to pass until after the election, if any, potentially in what they call the lame duck or end of year package. There are some possible triggers, like the end of that big debt ceiling negotiation is January 1st. So there might be reasons for them to come back and try to do something at the end of the year. And the chair of the Energy and Commerce Committee in the House, which oversees Medicaid, is retiring, and she has a 17-year-old son with disabilities. So she's trying to do something on bipartisan lines that perhaps she can get an end-of-year package. The four big ones for us are making Money Follows the Person permanent. This pays for transition services to get people out of nursing homes. It's a deinstitutionalization program. Right now, the funding goes through 2027, so we would like to see that. A second that we've provided some feedback on, so we'll have to see where they land, is lowering the level of care for 1915C waivers to expand it to a broader population than just those that need, in our case, the intermediate care facility level. There's some balance there because we don't want, although we want to serve people that have a lower level of care need it, we also want to make sure that it's not a zero-sum game where people with the high support needs, which was what Medicaid originally intended, don't lose out. So we're working with them on some protections there. Another is to open up portability for the first time and to say that dependents of military families can get access to, in effect, home and community-based services if they've already qualified in the state of their residence. And then finally, a little tweak to a Medicaid buy-in program. Medicaid buy-in programs are really underutilized because there's not much regulation. There is no regulation, excuse me, and there's basically no guidance. So there's not a lot for states to do quickly on. Medicaid buy-in is basically, if you're working, it allows states, and in the case of the state of Washington, to have no income or asset limits, but you pay a premium to buy into their home and community-based service program. So it's a way to allow people to work that are earning and can earn above that level in Social Security policies. So that's something we're going to be working on this year to look to see if we can get those in an end-of-year package. One of those programs does not go up to the current retirement age for Social Security, which is 67. So it's a small. And finally, there is, well, as we'll say, there's many big rules that this administration has put out. I would say, there's a lot of uncertainty because, again, based on what we have seen in the past, particularly Obama to Trump, a lot of these rules could be retracted or rewritten. And there's also likely litigation. But the Medicaid access rule is perhaps the biggest one. And potentially one of the biggest changes to the Medicaid program via regulation since the settings rule. So one of the big things coming up is these required Medicaid advisory and beneficiary advisory committees, something that states are going to have to do now to advise the Medicaid director, which has some advocacy opportunities There's going to be a grievance process around person-centered planning, and the HCBS settings rule, and the settings rule defines what is a home and community-based service that could receive Medicaid funds. An incident reporting system, so providers will have to report, for example, when there's a claim of abuse or if someone dies. Basically, that I don't know how to say it. That wasn't no one expected them to. Any kind of those events, someone gets hit, someone gets punched, they'll have to report those incidents. Then they try to do a lot of, in addition to the advisory committees, a lot of groups and disclosures to try to get your state to raise rates, because CMS basically says we can't force states to do that. So there's going to be another advisory group just on home and community-based service payments. There's going to be requirements for transparency for wait lists and payment rates. And then finally in 2030, there will be this compensation pass-through in the case of personal care, homemaker, and home health services. The implementation is over time, and it's a big rule. So there's a lot to dig in there that would take up a whole hour. But there's a whole lot of other important rules, one of them being on rights around Medicaid eligibility enrollment. That will occur really in 2027. Your state has to do some stuff around Medicaid managed care, although it's really not related to the things we do. Section 504 is another major rule about disability rights. Section 504 is the original anti-discrimination, disability discrimination statute for those who are taking federal dollars. And so there's a lot of access to medical care that's going to have to be updated. And there are some greater protections around concepts related to community integration that are now going to be part of this means to potentially, for example, sue state. There's also something called the overtime rule, which is going to raise for those who are administrative, executive, or compensation staff. If they're making under a certain amount, then it would trigger the need to pay them overtime, which is a good thing because we want to pay people more. The issue is we have to make sure that the Medicaid payment rates are adjusting so that providers, our chapters can say what happens. There's also litigation on that, so we've got of uncertainty. And finally, an important one that relates to the pool of direct care workers is the implementation of a staffing ratio for nursing homes. And right now they say only about 20% of all nursing homes are meeting the staffing ratio. And so that competition, and of course we need staff in nursing homes, so there's no neglect, but there is that competition. So that's something to watch as well. There's already litigation there. So a lot of uncertainty, but some potential major changes. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Robyn.
Thank you, everybody. I am going to try and move through this at a brisk pace so we have some time for questions. Next slide, please. Thank you. So first issue I want to talk about, actually the two education issues are kind of these ongoing issues the ARC has been fighting for, advocating for decades, unfortunately. The first is the issue of restraint and seclusion. The Keeping All Students Safe Act is the bill in both the House and the Senate that would ban the use of seclusion and put significant safeguards around the use of restraint. It provides, I think most importantly, provides funding for training educators and other school staff on alternative practices, so they are not using restraint and seclusion. Also says that parents must be informed within 24 hours of an incident of restraint, and that restraint or seclusion cannot be listed as an actual intervention on an IEP plan. So this bill has been introduced in both the House and the Senate. It has been referred to committee, and then that has kind of where it has stalled. This has been kind of the ongoing pattern for the last few Congresses. We have worked really hard to we have over 100 co-sponsors in the House and about 20 co-sponsors in the Senate. It is bipartisan in the House, which is a really big deal. We have not had a Republican on this bill in the past 3 Congresses. Representative Mark Molinaro from New York is the first Republican we've had on this bill in a while. And the bill is just unfortunately not moving. So we continue to beat the drum in the August recess toolkit that the ArcUS is going to be putting out. We will have some materials on restraint and seclusion because I know, this continues to be, a significant and, abusive practice for children both in the state of Michigan and across the country. Next slide. Other, again, ongoing, continuing issue, IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. This is the landmark bill that basically provides all of the guidance, all of the protections for students with disabilities. When Congress passed this bill 50 years ago next year, so the 50th anniversary is coming up, they said that Congress would provide 40% of the cost of educating students with disabilities. They have never come close. We are currently around like a 13 and change percent. And so states have to make up that difference, which means that many other programs are getting cut and we are not getting the federal funding that we need to support students with disabilities. I know David had mentioned the American Rescue Plan. The American Rescue Plan had given a huge pot of money to schools. And many schools had been able to use some of these funds to support students with disabilities as we come back from COVID. We've heard from many schools that they've been using this a lot on mental health and behavioral health issues, recognizing this was a significant issue both for students with and without disabilities. Since we don't really have kind of a prayer right now of getting a significant bump in funding, we've really been spending our time in identifying issues for the Department of Education to increase their oversight. Places that they can send guidance to states to say, hey, you're doing a really not great job on this. These are ways that you can address it. So we have found that that has been our biggest strategy is trying to work through some places where we know implementation is not going well. And again, there's lots of things coming up next year as we celebrate and also elevate some of the places where IDEA has not fulfilled its promise and where we still see students with disabilities struggling as we celebrate this milestone next year. Next slide. Childcare. So the ArcUS has not always been super engaged in the childcare space. So we have really, in the past 2 years or so, jumped in to this policy space. We recently worked with GAO, which is the Government Accountability Office, to create questions for a study, which has never been done before. There has never been a study done on how children with disabilities have difficulties accessing childcare. Sorry, I was looking at the question coming in. So that was really exciting that we're actually going to hopefully have some data and some insight into this issue. The current legislation that is out there right now in the childcare space really is focused on the pot of funding called the CCDBG, the Child Care Development Block Grant. Most of this legislation is really focused on kind of beefing this up. We really want to, we're really working with offices to introduce legislation that would kind of change the way that providers are reimbursed for caring for children with disabilities, to, greater incentivize providers to care for children with disabilities. and language that would really have greater oversight and kind of some mechanisms for when care providers are not fulfilling their duty to include children with disabilities. So this is something that we're kind of really still beginning to work with offices on. What does that legislation look like? I only have 2 more slides, I promise. Okay, Autism Cares Act. This is actually something that is likely to get passed because it is a must-pass bill. The Autism Cares Act is kind of our seminal bill that provides the bulk of the funding for autism research. It funds the USAID programs. It funds LEND programs. It creates the IAC, the Interagency Autism Coordinating Council. And this bill, it sunsets in September, which means if we don't pass a bill, all of that money goes away. Some bills, if we don't pass and we don't update them, nothing really happens. Like IDEA, we haven't updated in quite a while, but it just continues. This is not one of those bills. So it's really a must-pass bill. It has been introduced in the House. Yes, Karen, there is existing research. I know CAP, the Center for American Progress, did kind of put out a big paper that summarized a lot of this research. And those are some of the stats that, you know, we've been able to say for, you know, when we have put out things on social media about childcare. Autism Cares has been introduced in the House. It had a markup in subcommittee. It passed out of subcommittee. And it actually happened on Wednesday after I wrote these slides. On Wednesday, this bill passed out of the whole House Energy and Commerce Committee. So now we are waiting for the entire House to have a vote. The ARC just recently signed on to a letter saying, hey, House, get on this, have a vote. It has not been introduced in the Senate yet. So that is really what needs to happen in like the next couple weeks. There's some political reasons, including the fact that Robert Menendez is currently the lead on this bill, and he's going through a little bit of stuff right now. And so some members are a little reluctant to work with him on a bill. So we're working on getting this bill introduced in the Senate, but hopefully it will be passed by September 30th, which is when this would sunset. All right, last slide. I'm going to be really fast. Okay. There have also been a lot of updates that happened this week about this issue. So some of you might know there is a institution in Massachusetts called the Judge Rottenberg Center. It is the only place in the entire country that uses an electrical shock device to modify behavior for aggressive and self-injurious behaviors. The ARC has been advocating for 50 years for this abusive practice to stop. The United Nations Special Rapporteur for torture has said that this practice amounts to torture. In 2020, under President Trump, the FDA banned this device. JRC brought this to court, and because of this technicality, the ban was overturned. So the ARC advocated in 2021 for language in a bill that would basically close and fix that technicality that allowed the JRC to, you know, have success in overturning this ban. So we closed that loophole, and in March, the FDA resubmitted the proposed ban, saying we are going to ban this device again. About a month ago, comments closed. So the FDA had over 8,000 comments that came from people, almost all of them in support of banning this device. Nearly 6,000 of those comments were sent by people connected to the ARC. And so we were really excited, and we were really hopeful that there really wasn't another way that this could kind of go off the rails. On Tuesday, there was language in an appropriations subcommittee bill that would basically exclude the Judge Rottenberg Center from the ban on this device. So if the ban, the FDA finalized this ban on the device, the JRC would be excluded. I have basically been on the phone with staffers nonstop since Tuesday morning. Unfortunately, this did pass out of the subcommittee, which we expected. And now we are targeting the whole committee to make sure that this language does not make it out of the bill in the whole committee. The only representative from Michigan who is on the committee we are targeting right now is John Molinar. I am going to put my email in the chat. If anybody here lives in his district, please contact me. And I would love to touch base with you about how we might be able to have you email and contact his office. So keep your eyes out, because there's going to be a lot of stuff coming from the ARC-US on how to advocate. The markup that will happen on this bill is July 10th. So we have a little under a month to really tell as many people as possible in the committee why this is a bad idea. All right, we have 2 minutes for questions.
Oh, and as you'll see, sign up for the arc.org/action to get on all of our alerts. I do see that there was one question related to paid, and you can read the rest about how to get engaged. I do see there was some, at least one question on paying family caregivers. And of course, now I don't remember the exact rules, so I can speak generally. One is that there is a recognition from CMS that this is going to be a much more used pathway going forward, as well as from the state DD directors. What many of them are trying to figure out is, one, is it appropriate when there's that basic conflict of interest, which is to say, you can pick yourself and pay yourself as a provider because you're either the guardian or the parent of a minor child. When should that be appropriate? And also what if any oversight should exist? So generally speaking, it's really has become a state level issue, and there's not a lot of work at the federal policy level as to what could be addressed either way there. And it is something that I know the ARC chapters are looking at.
Yeah, I would just add, David, that the department hasn't said they're not going to do it. They just didn't get it together to put into the renewal applications that are going in for the waiver. So of course we commented that they need to do it on the renewal waiver. So if people are interested in, making comments on the waiver, I do think the department will get there. They're just concerned about Indiana's $1 billion deficit. I mean, they were moving towards this, and then they got freaked out by what happened in Indiana. So anyway, more to come. I mean, the ARC's long said, please do it, and we push on it. And at least they're talking about it. They did public comment earlier this year and heard families. So I do think that we will get there. It's just they move at their own pace and want to make sure that they're getting the things in order that David just spoke to. So.
And I know we're at the end, and I was trying to answer somebody with my email, so I'm going to put it in here, related to SSI, SSDI, and DAC. So they can email me at goldfarb@thearc.org. I can connect them with Darcy, and we can try to get them an answer on that. But I believe you're likely in that case of why we need work without worry. And so there may actually be some potential lobbying there too, unfortunately. So that's.
All right, I think you've answered all of the questions that came into the chat. And if you haven't taken a look at the chat, David and Robyn both pasted their email addresses in there for you to access if you're able or interested in doing some of that direct advocacy or have follow-up questions afterwards. Here on the screen, you see our information asking you to come back and join us again next Friday. We'll have the 2 sessions again, 9 a.m. and 10:30. And all of the information is available on the ARC Michigan website. When we log off of today's presentation, you might see a short survey pop up on your screen. And we would appreciate you filling that out and giving us your feedback.
Thank you,
Okay.
everybody.
Well, thanks.
Thank
See
you
you
so
guys.
much.
And hopefully we'll see you all in Columbus.